Let the words of my mouth and meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Well, we've got plenty of time for the sermon today, and if you come Wednesday night, you got to listen to me again, so get ready. Perhaps the message this morning is kind of more of a Bible study than it is a message, but I guess a little bit of both. It's a long gospel assigned for today, and Pastor Gary only read part of that. He said selected verses because it takes up a whole entire page for that. When we get ready for messages, we usually try to get a sermon title for that, and usually in the office they hound you for that until they get it there so they can get it in the bulletin. So I picked a title for today, Outcast of Outcasts. And Kay Castle, who does our bulletin cover, did a great job on the picture of Jesus there and the saying right below that. We could have had several other titles, Outcast of Outcasts. We could have given you the parable of the bad Samaritan. Have you ever heard that parable? Parable of the bad Samaritan. You've heard the parable of the good Samaritan, but we could have had the bad Samaritan. And we could have had the title of Two Thirsty People at the Well. Or I could have titled it this way: When Jesus did what he wasn't supposed to do. When Jesus did what he wasn't supposed to do. But that's too long a title. But that's really kind of what the gospel today is really all about. And we could do a series of sermons or Bible studies on the things that Jesus should not have done, or the things Jesus should not have said. And there are probably quite a few of those things. Jesus was sent to the cross because of what he did and what he often said. Things that weren't in keeping with the Jewish tradition for him to do or not to do. Jesus went to the cross because of his own people, because they sent him there, because he had said and done things that they weren't happy with him doing. Pastor of the church I attended in Munns Park, where we've gone for the last 12 years during the summertime, preached a sermon when he said, Jesus climbed up on the cross. He climbed up on the cross. That's nonsense. I think I said baloney at the last service, didn't I? Jesus did not climb up on the cross. He was put there by his own people. The same pastor referred to the gospel today at another time I went to that church when he said that Jesus knew that this woman was going to be at the well that day. That's why they went to Samaria, so he could meet her at the well. That too was baloney. That was not the case. Jesus and his disciples were traveling from Judea to Galilee. But to get to Galilee from Judea, you had to either go through Samaria or you had to go around Samaria. So Jesus and his disciples decide they're going to go through Samaria. And as they're going through Samaria, they needed some supplies. And so they stopped by a well about a half a mile outside of Sychar. That well had been there for a long, long time. It was called Jacob's Well. The town of Sychar had its own well. No town existed without having its own well. And they built the town around the place where the well was. Now, the Jews had a system that was against anybody who wasn't Jewish, anybody who wasn't an Israeli, because they believed that God only cared about them. No one else. We could talk a lot about that today. But the Jews were open to killing non-Jews, men, women, and even children during their time. And of course, they didn't like the Samaritans. And for them, there was no such thing as a good Samaritan. Many of you know what Samaritans are all about. I'll refresh you just a little bit right now. You have to go back about 400 to 700 years before Jesus, when the nation of Israel, 12 tribes, was divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom had 10 of the 12 tribes. The southern kingdom had only 2 of those tribes. But they were divided, much like this country was in its early history. The 10 tribes in the north in 722 were conquered by the Assyrians. Some of the Assyrians moved in to the area where the Jews were living there in what is now called Samaria. And the Assyrians intermarried with those who were Jews. And so there were mixed marriages as far as that part of the world is concerned. And so they became a mixed people, these people in Samaria. A mixed breed. A mixed breed. As a boy, up until I was in 2nd grade, I lived in northern North Dakota, just south of the Canadian border. And just north of the area where I lived in Rolette, North Dakota, was an Indian reservation. And oftentimes, our Caucasians intermarried with the Indians. And do you know what they were called? Half-breeds. And I heard that term in my church as I grew up there in northern North Dakota. Half-breeds. That's the way the Jews felt about the Samaritans. They were half-breeds. And they, like I said, they didn't think there was such a thing as a good Samaritan. But Jesus and his disciples, instead of skirting Samaria, went right through it, and they stopped for a break at Jacob's well, outside of the town of Sychar. They knew where that well was. Jesus' disciples decided to go into Sychar, and they'd have to mingle with some of the Samaritans there, but to buy supplies. But Jesus stayed put at the well because he was pooped. He'd been traveling, and he didn't want to go any further, so he stayed at the well, and he was thirsty. And a woman comes out of Sychar, and she comes to Jacob's well where Jesus was, and she's got her own bucket to draw the water. And Jesus says to this woman, "Would you please give me a drink?" And she's surprised that Jesus asks her for a drink of water. And she says, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan, for a drink?" And we could say a lot about that. But the Samaritans were outcasts to the Jews. But Jesus talks to this woman at the well. And Jesus is not supposed to do that. But like I told you before, Jesus often did things he was not supposed to do. And that's what got him into some trouble. And so he associates with this outcast woman from Samaria. But more than that, more than she's an outcast to the Jews, she is probably an outcast to her own people. Probably an outcast to her own people, a double outcast. Maybe you know at that time of history, the task of drawing water was strictly up to women. Did you know that? Men didn't draw water. Women did that. And if you remember the story when Jesus was looking for a place to have the Passover meal in and around Jerusalem, he told his disciples, "Now go down into Jerusalem, and when you see a man carrying a jar of water, follow him, and you will find a place to have the Passover meal." Because it was totally unusual for a man to carry a jug of water. Sychar had its own well, as had all the towns. It's noon when Jesus and his disciples get to the well outside of the town of Sychar, a time when people usually didn't come to draw water. But this woman comes out by herself to the well in the country to get her water. And probably she did that because she stayed clear of the other women in Sychar. Because probably the other women in Sychar didn't think she was a very, very good person. And she was even an outcast to them. Probably thought that of her because maybe she was divorced too many times. We don't know that from the scripture passage. But if you listen to it, she had been married 5 times. She'd been married 5 times. She'd had 5 husbands. Now, maybe she got divorced 5 times, or maybe her 5 husbands died. Either way, it wasn't a very good scene as far as this woman is concerned. Not good at all. But Jesus talks to her. And like I said, he's not supposed to do that. And he asked her for that drink. And then Jesus says, go get your husband. Now, why would he do that? Because a man was not supposed to talk to a woman in public unless her husband was present there with her. And so he says, go get your husband. And she tells him, I don't have a husband, but I've had 5. The man I'm living with is not my husband. How about that? He was a smart one. Wouldn't be too anxious to marry a woman who had been divorced 5 times or who had had 5 husbands die. That wouldn't be a very good thing to think about as well. So we give credit to this man who just lives with her and does not marry her. That's smart. We have many in our congregation, couples who live together that are not married, and that's okay. I have a service called a union service for couples who financially they can't make the arrangement to enter into marriage. And so but we have a pledge of unity for that. That's what I have often done and I will continue to do. But this woman is an outcast to the Jews and an outcast to her own people. But Jesus doesn't scold her, does he? He doesn't scold her. He doesn't put her down. Even when her own women in town wouldn't even deal with her. The outcast of outcasts. And while Jesus is talking to this woman, his disciples come back from town. And they're amazed. They're amazed at that Jesus is talking to this outcast woman. But Jesus had time for her. In spite of her failings, in spite of living with a man not married to, Jesus had time for her. Jesus made her feel like a person. She was bad news to the Jews because she was a Samaritan and an outcast to her own people in her town because of her lifestyle. But to Jesus, she was a person of worth. You know what? Jesus accepts people even when the church doesn't. And you see that right on the front page of your bulletin. Jesus accepts people when the church condemns them. Jesus still accepts. Let you put that into your own perspective as far as what you see as far as the church is concerned. You know what? I hope we keep learning from Jesus.